because I'm getting older. Maybe it's because of all the turbulence in the world. For whatever reasons, I find myself in an elegiac mood, bittersweet, aware of things decaying, aware of how time is getting shorter for me. And what came up in me was I wanted to speak a eulogy for my profession. I am not optimistic about the future of my profession. Uh, the part of me that's usually cheerful and thinking that good things will happen says the profession is going to be like the phoenix bird, maybe. It will have to die in order for it to be reborn in a very different fashion. And maybe I can rest content as I move through the final days of my being a member of this profession, feeling that the death that's coming is not going to be a permanent death, but only a transformative time. So I'm going to talk about a very broad sweep of the history of the human race on into why my profession exists, the twistings and turnings that have shaped my profession, and what the forces are that are currently killing it. Some of this I've talked about before, and I will be drawing on some things that are posted in other lectures. But this is a tapestry of its own that's very important to me as I participate in my final rounds as a member of the profession and now contemplate what's going to happen in the future to come. Let me start with a simple fact because I did minor in anthropology. For as long as the human race has existed, we have created cultures, and cultures create ways that people are to live, values, beliefs, rituals for interactions. There's no way to get a group of people together in a space without them creating all that. We seem to be lost without having a set of rules and principles to live by. So we create them. Uh, the downside of that is no matter what the culture is, where it is, how it's put together, what its belief is, somewhere between 10 to 15% of the people who are in that culture do not honor the rituals and behaviors of the culture. They are deviants. And every culture over any history we have has arrived at the same conclusions. There are two kinds of deviants. There are deviants who are just rotten people. They refuse to honor the rules. They do whatever the hell they please. They take advantage of other people. They don't do what's expected of them. They're bad. They are mean people, bad people. And cultures typically relate to those people by trying to punish them, kicking them out of the culture, that they do something to remove their awful behavior from the presence of all the others so that they don't continue to contaminate other members of the culture with examples of terrible behavior. It has to be crushed, all the terrible behavior. The crushing may be throwing them over cliffs, stoning them to death, putting them in prisons, or as I said, driving them out of the tribe to perish or whatever is going to happen to them. But another subgroup of the deviant people, the culture cuts some slack for. They're not just bad. Something is wrong with them. Some terrible process is going on. Ordinarily, they would be decent. They're not entirely responsible for their not being decent people. And there are a variety of theories about what is causing that. The devil has taken possession of them. They've been voodoo. The spirits have infested them, and the spirits are taking them over and are running them. They're not really in charge of what they're doing. Now we have psychiatric diagnoses. They have a psychiatric diagnosis, and the psychiatric diagnosis is making them behave in deviant ways. Whatever it is, whatever the explanation is, we cut some slack for those people. We act as if everybody has free will. The evil people have free will. They're choosing to be terrible, and they deserve to be punished. But the people in this group have diminished free will. Something is interfering with their difficulty in conforming their behavior to the dictates of the culture. And therefore, something should be done to help them. We don't need to kill them, punish them, or whatever. So every culture has derived a cadre of people who will try and help the deviants who are not so responsible for themselves, and a set of beliefs about what the right things to do to try and get them back into reasonable functioning may be. Sometimes it's moral education, sometimes it's Bible study, sometimes it's trephining. You cut a hole in the skull so that the evil spirits have an exit point out of the skull, and then they will become virtue-loving human beings again and conform their behavior to the dictates of the culture. No matter what we've done, though, neither of those problems go away. And as one who's put in some time studying it, I want to reassure my listeners today that the things that have been developed to supposedly help the deformed people who are not responsible, those rituals were often more terrible and more torturing than the rituals that were designed just to give pain to the people who were bad. That's my dark sense of humor, but it is the truth. At any rate, as we moved from a culture based on mythology and superstitions to a culture based on some kind of empirical studies, a big brouhaha started. The question is, who is to attend to and be responsible for the care and education of the deviants who are only partially responsible? How do we remediate the deviancy of those people, and what kinds of people should be doing that? Every culture has had specialized people to be doing that. In the Western cultures, for the longest time, it tended to be the religious orders. The religious orders would set up what were called asylums. People would be taken offline. They would be sent to the asylum, and they would be asked to pray a lot, and people would pray over them, and they would do Bible study, and somehow becoming better responders to religious rituals was the primary leading way of treating people who are mad during that period of time. Starting in about the 17th century, when physicians started to increase their empirical knowledge, there was the beginnings of turning over some parts of the care of deviant people to physicians now, rather than to the religious-oriented cadre of caretakers. There's a wonderful movie, The Madness of King George, which is a documentary, a docudrama about what King George III of England went through at the very time of the American Revolution. He became quite nuts. There are thoughts that maybe he had a diet somehow that was infected with ergot. That was what was driving him crazy. But it wasn't known for sure. At any rate, the first people who were to attend to him were the court physicians. And they would take stool samples, and they would change his diet, and they would give him things to flush out his urine and make his urine more pure. So the first attempts to make him, quote, sane again were physiological interventions of some kind being run by physicians. After a while, none of that worked, and the Queen, with the pushing of the Prime Minister of England, decided to bring in what was it? He was a pastor of the church, but he did not practice from a churchly orientation. He was the first kind of behaviorist. And he had had a reputation in a rural county of England of turning the lives around of some people who had been given up as being hopelessly deranged. So he was brought in to consult to see what he could do with the king. And the first thing he did was the king started to spit at him and scream at him and tell him to get away. And he said, "Your Majesty, That is not kingly behavior. You are not allowed to do that anymore. And he had the king's guards pick him up and put him in a wooden chair and strap his arms down and put a gag in his mouth so he couldn't be belligerent physically, and he couldn't curse with his mouth. And he said, you are not going to be released until you contain your behavior and act like a king and not like a squalid something or another. And he was continually cruel to him in that way, containing him, uh, uh, taking his meals away from as a punishment. And gradually, and maybe it had nothing to do with what the man was doing, but the king was finally restored to reasonable conduct and got back up on the throne and started to govern again. So this debate and battle went on. Is it a religious intervention of some kind? And of course, in other cultures that were called more primitive, there were what are examples? There were the voodoo practitioners. There were the people who did the trephining, letting out the spirits. There was a cadre of people who were part of the culture whose assignment was to try to liberate the spirit and souls of the deformed, crazy people from the grip that they were in. And depending on how that grip was defined, the interventions followed from that. By about the 19th century, however, everything turned finally, and it became the medical profession who inherited the responsibility for working with people who were forgiven partly because they were held not so responsible, but obviously were behaving in very strange ways and needed some kind of remediation. So now it was hospitals and sanctuaries that were created with medical practitioners that were the places that such people were taken to. Sigmund Freud and his neurological training knew of a place called the Salpêtrière outside of Paris, where people with strange behaviors were taken for study and attempts to help them. And he went and spent 6 months there watching and trying to figure out what was being done and what seemed to work in some way, in some useful ways, and did not. And it was there that Freud began to think that what we call mental illness is really strange behavior that results from repressed traumatic memories that have not been processed properly. He came up with a theory of what the cause was. The theory was a psychological cause. It was a failure in proper parenting, the infliction of trauma on the developing organism, and the failure to process the results of that trauma. That's what was the theory of what was causing difficulty. And he was struggling with, the first intervention he struggled with was to use hypnosis. He tried to use hypnosis for age regression. He would send in a hypnotic trance, he would send his clients back in time to various ages. He would ask them what they're remembering. And every once in a while, he would stumble across having sent the client into a time of great distress and stress. And the client would go through what Freud called abreaction, would start yelling in fear or cursing in anger, or start weeping with horrible, hideous disappointment and pain. And what Freud thought of as the repressed images and feelings attached to them would be in an abreaction. They were now being flooded out into real life and the interaction in the consulting room while under a trance. And there seemed to be a marked improvement in the behavior of such people after one or more of these episodes. Freud, however, was a neurologist. As his theorizing moved on, and I'll get there in a moment, he too was in the grip of his training. He was, after all, trained elegantly as a neurologist. He understood the brain and many of its functions, how the spinal nerve works, how the spinal nerves work, where various functions like hearing and vision and memory were situated geographically in the brain. how brain loops of various kinds were created to facilitate the thinking process. And he had by that time moved away from hypnosis. He thought that everything that was happening seemed real and true. However, whatever gains were being made under hypnosis did not last. Within a few months, the client was back again with the same paralysis, hysterical paralysis, or hysterical anesthesia, or obsessive thoughts, or whatever was the problem that had sent them for care in the first place, and nothing seemed to last. He then came up with the theory that there was some resistance to dealing with the material. And what he needed to do first was not bypass the resistance by artificially regressing people under hypnosis, bypassing the resistance in that fashion. He needed to understand and work with the client to identify and soften the resistance. Otherwise, there could be no permanent benefit of the analytic method. And he moved on to develop the method of free association rather than hypnosis. Clients were supposed to simply speak all their thoughts aloud freely, and he would listen from behind and not interfere with the flow of thoughts. But he would notice slight disruptions when they fell silent for a few moments, or the topic suddenly changed for no apparent reason. He would try to work with what had the client encountered that led to that moment of turbulence, because there the resistance was located. There something had happened. There certain fear had started, or certain need to get away from what was being talked about had manifested itself. And that was the work he needed to do. At the same time, he thought it was helpful to know what was likely being hidden. So he then started using dream interpretation a lot and began to write that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. In the symbolism of the dream and in the telling of the dream, the patient, the client, the analysand was actually alluding to the traumas of the childhood. They were embedded in the symbolism of the dream. So he undertook dream interpretation, but he never gave up being a neurologist. In the interpretation of dreams, he works very elegantly with how dreams can be worked with, and dreams can be educative, both for the client and for the analyst. However, the last chapter in the book, The Interpretation of Dreams, is called Towards a Scientific Psychology. And what is in it is his understanding of things neurologists had not discovered enough of yet, but he believed in. That is, he tried to describe what he thought were the underlying, as yet undiscovered neurological mechanisms that were actually where all this that was symbolic, that was imaginary, that was memory oriented, where in the neurology of the person these were being stored, in what kinds of circuitry, and how what he was trying to do was activating different kinds of circuitry. Some of it circuitry that was impeding what the client was trying to do to avoid, and other kind of circuitry he was activating that was facilitating the destinations he wanted to arrive at. So he had to think of his work not as a conversation about feelings, images, and memories, but as the manipulation by both the parties of certain kinds of neural circuitry. He was convinced that that's where the future lies. I'm pausing for a second to catch breath because I want to move beyond Freud. He did his major discoveries in his early important writings between about 1896 and 1907. Well, something was coming. There was a whole other river that was running, that was gathering strength. For hundreds of years, philosophers had struggled with what can we understand about human behavior? What is human nature? Why do people behave as they do? How do people learn? All the great philosophers struggled a lot about things like that. What is thinking? Descartes wrote a paper that thinking was the secretion of the pineal gland. All thinking came from somehow the pineal gland getting activated, and the pineal gland then secreted thoughts. And that's how and why we think. Once again, a neurological explanation for what was underlying everything we were doing. But these were the thoughts and thinking of philosophers. In the middle 1800s, empirical science was getting hold in all the sciences, in physics and chemistry and medicine. Everywhere there were human endeavors, those engaged in those endeavors thought of how can we get evidence that's undisputable about what is causing what we're looking at and how what we're looking at could be modified somehow. It was boiling everywhere. It was boiling in the disputations of philosophers also. And at least one powerful river had been set loose. The river was, how do people learn? Are they born with intrinsic knowledge of things that unfold as they get older and older? Do they learn because they're interacting with the environment and somehow the environment teaches them things? What is the process by which people learn? And now, not only were there arguments being written about what those processes are, but there were people in the philosophical, who were professors of philosophy, that were trying to collect data that would be determinative, that would help answer the questions. Is this really true, what we're saying about how learning takes place? So particularly in Germany, there were 3 or 4 very leading researchers in the field of how do people learn and what are the mechanisms that allow learning to go forward. These people, as is true everywhere, wanted to identify themselves. They started to call themselves not philosophers anymore. They started to identify themselves as psychologists, because psychology in its translation means the study of souls. That's what they felt they were doing. They were now committed that they were going to make an empirical study of the nature of souls. So they didn't want to be known as philosophers anymore. They wanted to take a new name. They wanted to become psychologists. So the first psychologists started to appear in the 1850s, and they fought the universities. They fought to have a different curriculum. They fought to teach the courses they were interested in. They fought to tell students that there was a new department, and the department was called psychology and not philosophy anymore. And power struggles and struggles for economic control of the curriculum began to go on in the European universities. And the people on the path of the new took hold and became more powerful and became larger in number, and were recruiting students to their ranks who wanted to do research also. And the movement became more and more powerful, and sure enough, we now have 2 separate disciplines. We have the discipline of psychology, and we have the discipline of philosophy. And philosophy absolutely argues about many things that psychologists are concerned of, but it does not follow empirical studies. That's not what it does. It is psychology that is the place where empirical studies of the nature of the soul take place. In 1895, the movement had gained enough force in the United States that the American Psychological Association was founded. There were about 200 faculty members now who called themselves psychologists in universities around the country, and they decided they would found a national organization. They would share papers with each other. They would hold meetings. They would have seminars, and the American Psychological Association came into existence. At the same time, I think it was in 1904, uh, another strange development took place. Strange because it had never existed before. There was a psychology department at the University of Pennsylvania. University of Pennsylvania is in Philadelphia. Some people on the Board of Education of the Philadelphia public school system had a brainstorm. They said there are psychologists in the psychology department studying learning very actively. We have a lot of people with learning difficulties enrolled in the Philadelphia school system. Maybe the psychologists have some kind of wisdom about how to respond to these people and how to address their very special needs that we don't know anything about, educators don't know anything about. Maybe the psychologists have some specialized wisdom. Let's approach them and see if they're interested in taking on this challenge. So they went to the leading person in the educational psychology branch of the psychology department. His name was Leitner Whitmer. What a strange name. And they asked him if they came up with some funds, could he start evaluating? They would pick pupils who were in trouble. Could he start evaluating pupils that they would send to him and come up with some kind of recommendations for ways of approaching them educationally that might be helpful to them? Like all university professors, Whitmer was very happy to get external funds to improve his budget and to have an entirely new function he could play around with. So he got some of his graduate school students and he founded on the campus the first psychology clinic. The clinic was a specialized one. It dealt with the evaluation of and remediation of learning difficulties. But they started processing referrals from the school district. They evaluated them. By that time, they actually had an instrument to use because the Stanford Binet test had been invented. And there was now an instrument to measure what was called intelligence. So here was another way to pick up empirical information. So they would test the kids, they would look at the literature about various kinds of learning impediments, and they would try to develop an individualized lesson plan. So for the first time now, there are psychologists who are not only research, knowledge to try to remediate a practical and extensive human problem. They were intervening directly in the lives of people who are handicapped in some way or another to try and help them to overcome the handicap. That started in 1904. There was, of course, an explosion coming. We were teetering towards World War I. Unfortunately and sadly, for those of us who have a romantic soul, there is no doubt that there are great technological leaps forward that take place if there's a large war going on. Technology improves, new inventions are found, new ways of doing things are discovered. There's a great leap forward that the culture benefits from. And unfortunately, that's a terrible price to pay to have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people being killed so that we can learn from it. At any rate, the US government knew of the existence of some kinds of ways of evaluating people. They knew already, it was common knowledge, that something called intelligence could be evaluated objectively. And they turned to the American Psychological Association and said, we would like you to help with the process of recruiting possible soldiers. We don't want to recruit people who are incompetent of following instructions and would screw up battle plans. We need people who have at least some baseline competencies of the things that will be needed of them. Also, we don't know much about what to assign them to do. Supposedly, some people would be better marksmen than others. Some people should be doing clerical work, and we're going to need a lot of clerical work done. Some people should be cooks. Could you help us with vocational selection in military service after people are drafted? And I forgot what the last one was. Oh, yes. We're starting something called the Air Corps, and people are going to fly. Can you help us identify people who should be ruled out? We shouldn't attempt to give flight training to, and other people who might have the bodily responsiveness, the state of mind, whatever it will take to turn into good pilots. So that's what happened. Every time somebody was drafted, they had to go through various kinds of people who would evaluate them and then figure out where to recommend assigning them to what kind of duties. And for the first time, we had quick intelligence tests, the Army Alpha and the Army Beta, two different kinds. There were only about 20 questions in it that could be taken very, very quickly at the time of the induction physical. And its correlation with the entire Stanford Binet was very high, about 0.87%. So those administering it felt it was a useful screening device with probably sufficient validity. And now we have psychologists and large number of people who are called psychologists trying to evaluate candidates for military service. Another applied use of the knowledge that was being generated by people who identified themselves as psychologists. World War II came to an end, and peace came finally. The economy began to pick up again during the Roaring 20s until the crash came. And we had learned a lot about men at war, about managing men, about systems of command and control, about what kinds of aptitudes were good for what kinds of occupations. And a group of people who had been employed by the government screening people who were coming into as a result of the draft were, of course, laid off as the war came to a close. And they were creative and inventive, and they thought maybe some of the skills they had in trying to direct hires to various places in a company could be used by large corporations. Maybe they could start evaluating people for hiring decisions. And industrial organizational psychology was born. And the people who had their foot in large scale corporations saw other needs. What makes for good morale in the work site? They started to study that and come up with hypotheses and test them. What contributes to work satisfaction? A whole burgeoning discipline of empirical study and applied practice flowing from those interventions unfolded over the whole decade of the 1920s. And by the early 1930s, there seemed to be a variety of what were called applied psychologists back then. There were applied educational psychologists dealing with education and educational limitations. There were, there were, quote, mental health psychologists, because by that time, projective testing had been invented and the Rorschach test was out in the market. And psychiatrists found that sending their clients to psychologists who knew the magic of giving these tests that were called kind of the X-ray of the psyche would speed up their work and give them new insights about what their clients needed from them. So there was a branch of applied psychology focused on that. And those are the main ones that existed. And the people who were applying psychology in the 20s and early 30s approached the American Psychological Association. By that time, the American Psychological Association had carved up divisions that were interest groups. One was the division of the teaching of psychology. One was a division of general psychology that tried to survey all the new knowledge that was being gathered in any one year. There was the division of experimental psychology. These people were the specialists on inventing data collection ways and statistical means for analyzing them for a variety of different kinds of psychological challenges. They were very inventive and creative. And I forgot, I think those were the three main divisions of the American Psychological Association. Those who were out there earning a living, doing something that was of a consulting nature to clients for fees or to corporations for fees, rather than being in the classroom teaching and doing empirical research, those people wanted to be in the American Psychological Association, and they wanted to be given a journal they could run, like the other divisions had journals they were publishing, and they wanted program time to put on symposia and teaching seminars. And the American Psychological Association turned them down. American Psychological Association had been chartered as a research academic institution under the federal tax code, and it didn't want people who were earning their living and were using psychology to make money directly. They didn't want those people in the American Psychological. They could come as members, but they didn't want them to be part of the administrative fabric of the association, because they were afraid the feds would see this as some kind of actual guild or union rather than just a research academic group, and would take away all the tax privileges that the American Psychological Association inherited. So the ones who got rejected were very pissed off, and they said, go to hell, and they founded the American Association of Applied Psychology. And now there were two National Association of Psychologists, one focused on delivering some kind of services to various publics of one sort or another, and one focused on acquiring new psychological knowledge, teaching in the classroom, and doing research. And there was bitterness and animosity between the two of them. Now I shall fast forward again. We are moving towards the 1930s. The Depression that came, and the muffled sounds of perhaps the preparation of war going on in the background of the lives of the European countries. And everybody was jockeying around for position. And once again, we were confronting a fact that would happen. The nation, our nation finally went to war. The European nations, there was a house of dominoes. Francisco Franco, who was the commander-in-chief of the Spanish army in 1936, led a rebellion. He overthrew the government. He declared himself a dictator, and he was going to be the autocrat that was going to run Spain, and a civil war started. And the Civil War was preparation for the World War that was coming, because everybody jumped in. The Russians particularly jumped in. They saw the nationalist government, the government had been overthrown, as the heroes who represented the people. And the autocracy of Franco was going to be that, an autocracy where the people would be plundered and exploited, and all the money would go to Franco and his family. So, and they needed to test new war equipment because they smelled that war was coming. So they aligned themselves with the nationalist government, and they began to send not only volunteers, but they began to send planes and tanks and other kinds of equipment so it could be tested in battle. The Germans loved what Franco was doing. They felt like Hitler and Mussolini had already aligned themselves. They knew that they could pull Franco into the alignment too as soon as he succeeded in defeating the ones who were opposing him. So they sent the Luftwaffe too with planes, and they sent lots of tanks and other kinds of war weapons, new kinds of howitzers, and they very actively supported Franco on his side. So a kind of mock subsidiary war of other people who were hiding that they had declared war was going on. In addition to that, in the same year, Japan had run out of enough food. The islands were too small to raise any more. They couldn't figure, nobody was selling them food cheap enough for them to take care of starvation beginning to happen in Japan. And they simply decided they needed more living space, so they invaded China. They were going to try and capture all of China. If they couldn't do that, they would carve off a big piece of China and make it Japanese territory. So that war was raging too in the Far East. Well, the war finally came after much tension. We had sanctioned the Japanese. We had tried to tighten down on them to prevent them from going ahead with the atrocities they were doing in China, and they had retaliated by striking at Pearl Harbor and knocking out most of the Pacific Fleet. They were convinced, as Putin was convinced, that with such a devastating blow to the Pacific fleet, there would be no protection against what they were going to do in the Pacific, and we would soon be negotiating some kind of peace settlement that would turn over a solid chunk of Manchuria, if not all of Manchuria, and most of the east coast of China would be ceded to Japan. We would sue for peace in order for us not to see even more devastation in the Pacific. Well, they were wrong. We got very pissed off, and the war was undertaken with a vengeance. So what happened? Mobilization was really very inspiring in some ways, frightening in some ways, and it's about as complete as we could. By the second year of war, 20% of all American males who could see lightning and hear thunder had been drafted and were in the military. That's a huge part of the workforce. It started women's liberation in our country because in order to fill those positions, the factories were running 24 hours a day. Women had to come in and learn various skilled trades in order to replace the men who were going to war. And it helped create the profession that I am now in, and I am lamenting its loss. By 1942, it was apparent to the government that there would be a tremendous number of what was called psychiatric casualties of the war. It used to be called in World War I. We now have to live through. And lots and lots, a much greater proportion than the general population, a much greater proportion of the people serving as staff in mental hospitals were drafted out of the civilian mental hospitals and given commissions in the services and put to work with dealing with the people who were at risk on the war fronts in various places. So what the hell, what kind of care was going to be given? Again, there was a ramping up of trying to train women to take over slots in those hospitals. People were called back out of retirement. Very elderly psychiatrists started showing up in the mental hospitals again. And the government decided it had to strike a balance. It couldn't deplete that too extensively. So it wanted to create a cadre of helpers who would go into military service and would be like the handmaidens of the people who had the frontline responsibilities for dealing with those terribly wounded soul people who are being created. So I can tell you a direct story from one of my cousins. He showed up for to go to the induction center and to go to the fort where he would be stationed for a month while he would be evaluated, taught basic Army skills, and then sent out somewhere, assigned somewhere in where the war was going on. And one of the things that was quickly made apparent, he was asked, did you have any psychology courses while you were in college? Did you go to college? Did you have any psychology courses. And anybody who said that they had psychology courses, for God knows what reasons, they were assigned to the medical corps scattered all over the place. They were going to take up the handmaiden responsibilities. So most of them were assigned to units at or near the front. They were dealing with people who were just screaming and falling apart and weeping and couldn't pick up a gun anymore, or who were panicked and in terror and couldn't calm down. And they learned to be on the front, on the line. They were taught techniques by the psychiatrists. Sometimes it was to give a sedative injection and then to try and do abreaction, have them talk about what they had lived through while they were partly narcotized. Sometimes it was just keeping them company. Sometimes it was to get them to pray. Sometimes it was to tell the story of what they had lived through over and over again, but they were the handmaidens to what the psychiatrists were trying to do. And many, 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 thousands and thousands and thousands of such people who had some college education in psychology services, courses were put to work in that kind of service during World War II. Well, as was expected, we prevailed. We won the war. The hostilities came to a close, and people started getting mustered out. What was to become of them? This time, our government by 1943 had become both wise and kind. And every war thereafter, every war since the Revolutionary War, when those wars ended, whoever was serving in the military were brought to some location, some base. They were given severance money. They were often given transportation money back to where they were going. Sometimes they were given some money to adjust to a new life, and they were just discharged back into the world. No attempt was made to help them to discover what to do with their lives after 4 or 5, 6 years of their lives had been taken away from them in military service. This time, the government was not going to make the same mistake. It was going to do two things. For those who were impaired, it was going to make sure that there was adequate care from them given by the Veterans Administration. So a serious attempt could be made to heal both not only the physical wounds they had been dealt, but the psychological wounds that had befallen them too. So lots and lots of people who used to work in the military would need maybe to find careers in the VA, because they would be shifting over from things they've been doing in the military to things they were now doing for people who had become civilians. And there was a tremendous explosion towards the end of the war in the building of new VA hospitals scattered all over the country, so that there would be places for the emerging soldiers to come. In addition, the government took responsibility for what were then called adjustment problems. Some of the soldiers were going home to wives who had been unfaithful or even divorced them. Some of the soldiers were going home, and maybe the woman had gotten pregnant on one of the leaves, or maybe gotten pregnant before he left. And the guy's going home to children who are now 3, 4, or 5 years old and never met him, and he's never met. Some of them are going home to corporations where women are doing the jobs that they used to do, and there are no jobs for them anymore. What are they going to do to earn a living and help support their family? So the government turned to the American Psychological Association and asked the American Psychological Association what could be done to help with healing the psychologically damaged, and what could be done to help the adjustment problems. And whoever was on the board of directors of the American Psychological Association back there had some brainstorming meetings, and they came up with what they considered 2 new professions. There would be a profession called clinical psychology, and it's called clinical because those are the handmaidens to help heal the wounded psyches, so the people that need care in that domain. And there would be a career called counseling psychology. They would work with veterans who were having trouble, quote, adjusting to civilian life again, and work with them until they had settled in. They felt more comfortable. They knew what they were going to do with themselves. They had new career possibilities that were starting up, and the VA could let go of them, wish them well, and send them off into their separate lives. That was really quite noble. I am proud of the government for wanting to do that. And like every other bureaucracy, things got fucked up and didn't go the way they were intended. But that was certainly a noble aspiration. And the money was going to be made available to do that. So the next question that was posed as the war came closer to ending to the American Psychological Association: what is the curriculum of these two careers that should be created? Are these bachelor level careers? What are the courses that people are going to create? These master level careers? What are the courses they're going to take? What kind of bachelor's degree do they need to be eligible for admission? Are these doctoral level courses? What do they need to have to get into the doctoral program that's going to train them? And what is the coursework and practical experience is going to be that they're going to have? So committees of the American Psychological Association got to work with this. Now remember, all of them in the American Psychological Association are research academic psychologists. They are not used to preparing people for lives of various kinds of service. They've never done it. They've taught courses to people and they've done interesting research, but they've never had any skill courses that they were teaching about how to remediate somebody who doesn't know what to do with his or her career. And so they answered two questions to the government. One was they thought it should be a doctoral program. Well, doctoral level psychologists love being connected to and teaching doctoral level students. And they said the departments of psychology will be responsible for setting up the necessary personnel who would teach the courses. And they came up with model curriculum. There was a lot of overlap in the knowledge that the clinical psychologists and the counseling psychologists were going to get, but there was a lot of information on interest testing, skill testing, what goes on in a corporation, a lot of practical experiences to be given to the counseling psychologists. They were given courses on marital distress and what can be done about marital distress. They were given courses on what are the essential elements of child rearing. It was a very general and I think wonderful curriculum, better curriculum than the clinical psychology curriculum, I would say in hindsight. That was a curriculum about what do people know in order to live effectively. And they were going to train students who would become more experts on what the returning soldiers needed to know to participate effectively in a life that was worth living. And government said, fine. And we will come up with the grant money to your programs. You poll all the graduate programs in psychology that are currently in place. Tell us the ones that are willing to expand their mission and add on these two new curriculum tracks, and tell us the budget you need in order to make this possible. And oh boy, there's nothing that the Department of Psychology loves better than having extramural funds that they could add to the department's budget. They love that. Now, I will say a sad thing from my perspective. Many of the departments that took the federal money to start the training of these people under the federal programs were rip-off artists. They diverted some of the money for new lab equipment they wanted. Some of the faculty hires they made were illustrious researchers that they had been wooing, and now they had extra funds. They really neglect, they assigned the teaching of some of the skill courses to their own faculty and asked their faculty to become more knowledgeable about how to teach those things without any real helper training. And I listened to fellow graduate students because I grew up in this era who were in one of those pathways, and I was sickened by the kind of education they were getting and how stupid they felt and how much they were trying to teach themselves. From my perspective, it was a scandal. Oh, God. Another healing thing began. Since the departments of psychology were expanding in the ways I'm describing with the federal money, peace talks broke out between the American Association of Applied Psychology and the American Psychological Association. And the two organizations decided to merge at last. And two new divisions of the American Psychological Association were created. A division of clinical psychology, three, a division of clinical psychology, a division of counseling psychology, and a division of industrial organizational psychology, so that all the people who had been functioning as, quote, applied psychologists could now come under one umbrella with their own organization merged with the American Psychological Association and have a recognized division carrying the name of the activity that they were engaged in. That was a wonderful thing that happened. It happened in 1947, finally. I think I will stop here because I need to take up the tale of how I got personally involved in becoming an applied psychologist and started down my own career path. But I can pause at this point because all the preparations are now in place. You understand the world that came to create the profession, what textures it was created of, what beliefs, either correct or false, were part of its underpinnings, and where we were headed and where the trains were going. We're about to leave the station. Okay, I'll stop and take any questions or comments at this point.
I was thinking about kind of like the beginning of my interest and the beginning of my career, Arthur.
Yeah.
And, you know, as you know, I went to the University of Michigan for undergraduate. And in my freshman year, I participated in a course called Outreach. And I had heard about it and I thought, well, gee, this sounds very interesting. And it was a part of the psychology department, and what it did is it provided experiences for undergrads in many different settings, and kind of like the setting that I went to, which probably was significant in terms of my career choice, was Northville State Hospital.
Oh, yeah.
And I went to Northville State Hospital with a group of students in a van, and we sat and we talked and we interacted and we ate with pretty severely mentally ill patients.
Yes.
And I thought that was great fun.
Wait, was that a one-time experience, or was
No,
it a regular thing you did over a period of time?
Yeah, it was over a semester. And we would go once a week, and we would, for 3 hours or so, 2.5 hours, we would interact with the patients. And I thought that was a blast. And I thought that was the greatest thing that I could ever do or experience. And that influenced my career. So in some ways, if you're thinking or moving towards kind of like the end of the profession, I think that there's always going to be a need, to work with, treat, and interact with the mentally ill.
Absolutely. I'm not going to deny that. I'm just going to say that there's not going to be a profession of psychology necessary that does that. Also, you make me feel so pleased because, I did my graduate work at the University of Michigan years before you were there as an undergraduate. And I was pleased to be there. That was one of the universities that took very seriously the charge that they need to hire faculty to teach the courses that they were being required to teach. And they rescued some European psychoanalysts and made them part of the faculty. They got people out of departments, what had been called departments of counseling, out of education schools, and they brought them to be part of the psychology faculty. They took the mission very seriously, and I got a very good education.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an example of what the department was like, that they would have such a thing, maybe to interest some students in making a career choice of devoting themselves to such a population.
Worked for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's crazy when I think about the history of psychology, you know, such as modern, as we consider modern psychology, and how oftentimes I complain about how we're kind of thrown at every problem there is, you know, and then you can see as we came up through history, it's just no matter what popped up, well, maybe the psychologists will figure it out. You know what I mean? And now we're just getting, you know, there's other directions that it's all pushed. Now the problems are all just turning into, you know, ICD-9 codes and everything, and then they'll be solved that way by.
That's right. We'll find the right pill for a psychiatric diagnosis.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll get to my rant about that next time we talk, I'm sure. That's one of the ways we're being killed.
Yeah. In some ways, I long for the days. I personally, when I talk to people, I like the struggle of the non-specific reality of what we're struggling with, as you know, with each person, and how vague sometimes that is. But we know there's something that needs to be fixed. And I think, you know, losing that is a devolution.
Well, I'll give a little tidbit of my future assessment. We're not too far off from artificial intelligence being asked to interact with the client. There are people doing the research already. What are the typical ways that a therapist interacts with a troubled client? And we can create a robot that will do that, and it will be much easier, and it will be indistinguishable from what a human being would be doing.
Yeah.
And if what the human being is doing is recommending various manuals for behavioral therapy for the client to fill out, clearly that's easy for a computer to recommend. Name the right manual to start to work on.
Yeah.
Oh, God Almighty. All right, again, we'll foreshadow a little. There is no substitute for an intimate relationship of kindness and mutual respect between two people. That is a very, very powerful thing. And I think it is really the essence of what we do, and the real tool of what we're trying to do. And everything is coming together to try and crush that out of what psychologists are, what anybody is. I don't know where anybody's going to get that. Maybe if you find a significant other that's worth having by your side, maybe you'll get it there, and that's the only place, because none of the professions is going to provide that. There'll be a bunch of technicians doing a bunch of things. And I will talk about all the economic incentives that are driving in that direction. All right. Thank you for listening to me today. I will be back next week.
All right.
Bye now. See
Bye.
you. Bye.